My name is Jonathan Tran Pham, and I'm the founder and CEO of Reflect.
Welcome to The Vietnamese. I'm your host, Kenneth Nguyen. Being part of a culture of nearly 100 million Vietnamese people in the world today comes with a lot of pain, proud history, and privilege. Join me as I highlight and explore the Vietnamese experience from all over.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
So tell me about your journey through therapy.
Wow, we're going to start with all the heavy stuff. This is great.
Unless you want to get to, we could do a little light questions before, but I am always interested in Vietnamese people who take the bull by the horns, because it's a difficult thing to do, to come from a background of very closed communication in our world to jump off and do therapy. So I want to know what your journey in therapy has been.
Yeah, it's a great question. I love the heavy stuff. So let's go right into it. I love it. It's interesting because if, as I didn't really have a lot of exposure to therapy as a kid. And, I grew up with very traditional Vietnamese parents who came over in 1975 during the war. And so we never talked about feelings. We never talked about even our history as a family. So I didn't really grow up with a lot of like touchy-feely topics. And it was really just go to school, work hard, the world's tough, you got to fight. That was sort of the lessons I learned growing up. And I was really good at doing that. I was a good student. I worked really hard in high school. Always was about pushing myself forward and kind of like continuing to, like, if I ever had difficulty, I would just swallow it and keep pushing. If I ever felt frustration, I would just swallow it and keep pushing. And it really, I went to Northwestern, a great school. I worked in consulting, in management consulting, got a really hard job to get, and was working 100 hours and never complained and kind of kept pushing forward. And it really was kind of like in like mid 2010s, like 2015 or so, where I was working for a very demanding startup, woke up one day and realized I had been stressed and been stressed for a very long time. Thank you, Tiger Mom. And I didn't really know what to do. I talked to some friends, and then finally was like, I think I need to talk to somebody about this. And just getting to that journey where I was accepting and willing to talk to someone like, inside myself was actually a really, really hard thing to do because, I kind of grew up always about, like internalizing the feelings as opposed to externalizing them. And I think in many ways, that was the best coping mechanism that my parents had to go through all the horrible stuff that they went through. But, started to talk to friends who really encouraged me to think about therapy. And it really was actually my roommate when I was living in San Francisco, who was like, have you ever thought about seeing a therapist? And immediately I was like, no way, never, I'm not crazy. That's not for me. And in my head, the person that needed therapy was such a very sick, really, really like you need to be at the end of your rope to be looking for therapy and to ask to get help. But she was someone I respected. She was also a startup founder. And I was like, well, if she can see a therapist, maybe it's something that could be beneficial to me. And so I started looking for a therapist, and I had actually a really frustrating experience. I'd almost argue the experience, I thought it would be hard to realize I needed therapy, but it was actually really hard to even find a therapist. And that was surprising to me. I was like, I thought I did the hard stuff by saying I need a therapist. And, but what I didn't realize is actually how hard it is because, I didn't even know where to start. I didn't know what to look for. I didn't know, there are different types of therapy. I didn't really know anything about the therapy space. And so it was a lot of trial and error. And I actually, tried multiple therapists before I found the right therapist for me. And that honestly, I almost gave up many, many times during that experience, but I'm so grateful that I didn't because therapy has changed my life. It's changed, I didn't even realize what I didn't know before going into therapy. And a lot of like having a space, first of all, just to talk about your feelings, what you go through, your emotions, that was really beneficial for me because I'd never had that before. I never really had a space to be able to just process things that were going on in my life, questions, challenges. It all kind of just ruminated inside my head. And so for me, that was actually really, really beneficial just to have someone to listen. And actually, it was very surprising to me. I learned a lot about like things that go on in my head actually are very different from how you see the world or how my therapist sees the world. And I was like, wait, that's not how everyone would react to the situation. Like even that for me was a huge learning. And so the other thing therapy did was it really gave me tools and resources to think about the world a different way, manage my emotions a different way, interact with other people in different ways. And it's just seeing the positive change that's happened in my life. Now I'm the biggest proponent of therapy. I think everyone should be in therapy, and we should have our kids be going to therapy, and we should have our parents be going to therapy because it is the one thing that you can do for yourself that can change you and everyone around you. And I think that is the most amazing opportunity you have in your life.
See, now that wasn't too hard to start with, right?
Hey, you know what?
We
This is
just
going to
got
be a great podcast. This is going to be a great conversation. I can already feel
we
it.
jumped right into the deep end of the pool. Thank you for that. I really appreciate you opening, and that makes sense. This is a great starting point because disclaimer and a preface to what I'm about to ask. I'm just playing devil's advocate. I did therapy for 7 years from 25 to 32. When I was 25 years old, I was really in just screwed up, and I knew I was screwed up. So I took this 7 year journey and I went through it. But I look back today and I'm like, okay, at the time, I just was quiet and silent about my mental traumas or whatever. But today, everybody's talking about their, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here.
Hmm.
Just remember, I did 7 years of this.
Yeah.
But how do we know as a culture that we are not turning into a bunch of crybabies and everybody, which way we turn, has to go look for mental help? Tell me and walk me through the difference of sort of probably the time period that you went through to today. Is it different, or have we always needed this and we just didn't know?
Mm. I think it's a good question. I don't think anyone has the right answer for this, right? And if you ask different generations, you ask, generation above us and the boomers and those older, they made it like we just kept our mouth tough upper lip and we
Yeah.
lived life and look at us now, right? And I think there's no right answer. And for me, I think I'm really grateful there's more awareness about mental health now than there was before. Just because I think so many people were suffering in silence. I think, mental health is the number one or two leading cause of death for men under the age of 40, right? So it's always been a problem. It's just whether we talked about the problem or not. And you look at like veterans who are some of the toughest and who've seen the worst things. The suicide rate among veterans is so
Wow.
high, right? Addiction rates, suicide rates. So I would rather be a society where we all think we're crybabies than a society where we're killing ourselves. So for me, I think that the change has been a really good one. And I think that, sometimes you think about like, grit is really important. As a founder, I think about grit and the need to have grit is really important. But I really didn't understand like what does that even mean? And so I thought, the tougher you are on yourself, the more grit you have, right? The more the world beats you up, the more someone screams at you, the more you can kind of tough it out. That is grit. Yet all the studies show that that actually only gets you to some point, and then it inevitably you crumble. And I have amazing friends of mine that went to all the top schools and had all the top jobs and hit a wall. Every single person I know has hit a wall. And so I think that kind of story only goes so far. And actually, what the research shows is if you're more compassionate to yourself, if you're actually kinder to yourself, if you're showing more love to yourself and those around you, what actually happens is we think it makes you soft, but what it actually does is it makes you try more things you wouldn't try otherwise. And so for me, I think one of the challenges growing up the way I did, like always succeeding, always getting A's, was a real fear of failure. And that fear of failure is something I process a lot in therapy because I was like, wow, I'm actually afraid to put myself out there. I'm afraid to try on certain things because of a fear of failure. And so I think if you're more aware of who you are, your emotions, you're able to work better with one another. I think the grit is still there, but it's a different flavor of grit. It's not a struggling grit. It's a more relaxed, excited grit. It's not like I got to do this or else no one will love me, or I've got to do this or else I'm worthless. It's oh, isn't this fun? Like, wow, I want to start a company. Let's just try it. What's the worst that can happen? And I think that is a level of kind of like toughness that
Yeah.
is really admirable. Now, of course, there's, you know, I'm not a parent, but I look at how thoughtful my friends are in raising kids, and how my mom was really hard in raising and trying to raise me the best she could. And so I think we're always afraid of there's a balance. So I think you still want your kids to struggle. I think you still want your kids to try and challenge themselves, but you want to do it in a way where it's safe that they won't lose your love if they don't do well, right? Or you won't lose your own love if you don't do well. And so I think that there's definitely a balance.
What you just said and how you answered reminds me of perhaps, when we are experiencing a journey like being a founder, all of the tough stuff that appears, it's almost like having a Sherpa come up the mountain with us, that a therapist can really say, your oxygen levels are right here. Maybe you have to look at it this way. The campsite that we need to hit, before nightfall is here. And all of these things are not crybaby solutions, but rather having a Sherpa go up a mountain with us during, like being a founder is a very tough thing. And we'll get into that too, because I think the intersection of being a founder and the tough, the sort of like the not knowing part of being a founder, it can really bear down heavily on your mental situation.
Oh, I have a lot to say about my mental health as a founder. And I think, but I think it's what your analogies are a really great one because a few years ago, actually, I climbed Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa. And I was not a strong hiker. I love the outdoors now, but at the time, I bought my first pair of hiking boots the week before I went to Tanzania. And it was, I think maybe naivete that's actually a great analogy to being a founder. You got to kind of not know what you're going to get because you just might not do it. But the big slogan when you're climbing Kilimanjaro actually is pole pole, which means slowly, slowly.
Wow.
And we had amazing porters that were with us. And you see marathon runners, you see Ironman people that flame out. And the reason why is because, you need to have someone there, especially if you've never done it before, to say, hey, take it slow. Or let's actually rest for a day so we can acclimate to the altitude. Or, hey, like I'll carry this when you need it. I would not have summited Mount Kilimanjaro, if it weren't for the Sherpas and the porters that were there with us. And it really was leaning on their wisdom to be able to know when to go and when to push. And again, sometimes they'd be like, hey, you're tired, but let's keep going. Let's just go slowly. So they weren't like, oh, immediately as soon as you are struggling, oh, let's quit. Let's go down the mountain. We don't need to do this anymore, right? It's not, that's what people think kind of therapy is,
Yeah.
but it really was through their collective wisdom of talking to, hundreds and helping people up the mountain when you should push and when you shouldn't push. And them getting to know you and your individual boundaries and where you can push and where you can't push. And I think that kind of journey and that relationship is very akin to how I work with my therapist. And I mean, she is she's someone that I trust implicitly. And I think she knows me really better than almost anyone else because of how much I've shared about my life and how she's able to gauge me. And she works with me very, very differently than she may work with the client right after me. And so it really is a very personalized experience.
I don't know how to say this without sounding like an absolutist, or somebody who looks down on other cultures or looks up to other cultures or compares. But I just can't help but to say this and to think about this, that cultures that let in the idea of therapy is a little bit more advanced than cultures that are closed off to it. And here's what I mean by that. This idea of self-awareness. Let's just take a country like Vietnam. Fuck it. Let's just go there. God damn it. We are so damn closed off to like being self-aware of our shit sometimes, and being from a family of, obviously Vietnamese people, I can say that. And then being close, I won't name other advanced cultures, but I know other advanced cultures that really stick to their regiment of having a therapist in their families. And they do it for their marital issues. They do it for their business. They do it for coaching. How much of that do you agree with me? And I don't mean like, we're not in the spirit of trying to put other cultures down, but it really does bother me when I think about like the entirety, of this sort of this therapy culture in my family, the entirety of them just looking down on it. I remember it just like such a dirty feeling when they heard that I did therapy. Like, is something wrong with you? Crazy? But that's after 47 years being on this earth. I just think about that. I'm like, every time I see like these cultures that really, embrace therapy, they're just, they just got a little bit more self-awareness.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I don't know, I would even say even more broadly, I think it's not just about therapy, but it's also about connection with one another and openness to communities. And I think that in some ways, the Western world has gotten, America's created a problem of individuality and created a problem where we feel more alone than we've ever felt in our life. So there is definitely an epidemic of loneliness that didn't exist when we were in farming communities or when we were in villages with one another. But when I was 18, I moved away to college. I grew up in Houston, Texas, and was very far from my family and community. And so you think about sort of the way that a lot of us live our lives, it's very individualistic. So I don't want to like idealize one culture and put down another, but I will agree with you that the Vietnamese culture is really, even though we're a community oriented culture, there's a lot of kind of shame and a lot of like closeness that we feel. Like, what if this other person finds out this is about you? Like, how would they judge you, or
Yeah.
how would other people judge you? And I think that really prevents us from seeking help when we need help. And I think the reason we as humans live in communities is to help one another, right? Like, we wouldn't survive on the, savannah or at caveman times if we didn't have one another. Like, when you're going to sleep, you need someone to stay awake to make sure you don't die. That's not being weak. That's just smart survival skills, right? And I think that we've gotten this world where it's like now we don't want anyone's help. And I think one of the reasons why, I mean, again, I'm not a therapist, but for me, I think going through this trauma of the war that a lot of Vietnamese Americans went through, it's a really traumatic experience. And I think, what it shows, whether it's the Holocaust or whether it's war, when you go through these experiences, you become more rigid, more closed off, have a lot of black and white thinking, you're more afraid. That's just what you do to protect yourself, right? Um, and I think that it's helped us survive, but again, it doesn't help us thrive and live healthy lives and build relationships. And I know a lot of families that are kind of resentful or kids that don't, have good relations with their parents because of this very strong, rigid black and white thinking where it's like, I can never go to my parents for help, or I couldn't go for them when I'm having a bad day, right? I think that's a very lonely way to live life. And it's actually as lonely as the American way of living life and being individualistic. So I think that therapy or going at least seeking the connection and being a self-aware of what you need and being okay saying I need something, I think that's in a very self-evolved way of thinking because it's something that inherently it preserves you. It actually allows you to succeed more because you're getting help from people around you in a way that if you're just closed off or you're just like living your life and never thinking about how you can improve, I think that's a very short-sighted way of living.
Thank you for expanding my cross-cultural comparisons here, because that's a really great answer. And I try not to get too married to my beliefs. And I ask that question with this like real feeling that the self-awareness thing is very low, from our community, and I want to change that. I want to be able to hear thought leaders like you in this space talk about the realities of it. And you just did. You really just opened up and be like, well, here's another way of looking at it.
But I'll tell you, I agree with you that, I believe in growth mindset, and I believe that, I wouldn't have started a company to help people with therapy if I didn't believe you could change your life and change the world. Right. And I think that, I look even at my mom and I think how much she's changed and grown. I look at my family. I believe all of us have the power to change and grow. And so it does require the desire and it requires self-awareness. And I think that, I have a lot of examples in my life of people that are much older than me who at the end of their life feel regret and want to make changes in their life and it's too late. So I think that if we can get that self-awareness earlier, especially as people, and I agree with you, Vietnamese people, as a culture, I would love for us to be more self-aware and be more open to change. I think that really has the power to improve our community. And I think it's possible because Vietnamese people came to a country where they didn't know the language, weren't educated, started their lives and have thrived in this country. So anything is possible. Like that is a definition of change. If we can change our location and we can change other things, we should be able to change what's within us if we want to.
In the last 5 years, there was a proliferation of a lot of companies that do online therapy. What made you decide that this moment is the right moment for you, and why start something that it's a space that has a lot of players, but it just seems like there's a lot of finance and muscle that you need to get into that space.
Yeah, it's funny because when I started Reflect over 5 years ago, everyone was like, why are you talking about mental health? This is such a niche, weird topic. Like, and I was coming from consulting and from the fashion world, so seen as much sexier. But for me, I knew in my heart that this was something that was broken and needed to be fixed. And I'm really glad there are more companies that are out there that are helping solve this problem. I think it's a massive problem that needs to be solved from lots of different angles. And I think for us, what we do at Reflect is we're a platform that makes quality mental health more accessible. And we do that by matching you to the right therapist using an AI-driven matching algorithm. And I think for me, it solves what I think is a really under solved problem. There are places to go find a therapist now, but you have no idea whether the therapist is good or not. And you have no idea whether the therapist is the right fit for you, which is really the problem that I had, right? It wasn't just finding a therapist, it was finding the right therapist for me. And I think, what I realize and what all the research shows is the best predictor of success in therapy is what's called therapeutic alliance or the fit between you and your therapist. And if you're not going to trust your therapist and it's not going to be a fit, then you're never going to open up and you can never build that relationship where you actually feel the trust. All right. If I didn't trust my porter or my
Mhm.
Sherpa when I was going up the mountain, I wouldn't have listened to them and I would have probably flamed out. And so I think that that trust is really important. And so what we do at Reflect is we really help predict what the right fit is for you. So like, just like me, I didn't know anything about therapy when I first started. Being able to have, we are the Sherpas for folks looking for therapy, actually. We kind of are their guide to be able to help them understand what they might need as in therapy and who the right therapist is for them. And I think that's really what's been different about Reflect and has made us really successful. We're now, the largest non-insurance network of therapists in California, and we've done over 100,000 therapy sessions to date. And I'm really proud of that because each of those is a relationship and a life that we've changed thanks to the work that we do.
If I wipe my brain from all the therapy, because I did 7 years officially, and then I had a series of like marital counselors and all kinds of different programs in between or after my 7 years. If I wipe my brain completely clean of all the experience that I've ever had with therapists, and I had to go back and like quantify or qualify, how, what would you say is the wrong therapist, or what would you say is the right therapist? Like, how do I know after a few sessions if I'm seeing the right person or the wrong person?
That is a great question. And I think that there's no one right answer for everybody. So I think it really matters more about what you need as an individual. And so not knowing a lot about you, I would say, the things that matter the most is to be able to have a style and a background that meets your background. So at Reflect, we'll ask some questions about like basic demographic things. Would you feel more comfortable talking to a man or a woman? Are you more comfortable talking to someone maybe who's Asian, Vietnamese, speaks Vietnamese, not? And so those are the kind of the top level things that are helpful. But I think the next piece is actually what really matters, which is what kind of style is right for you. So for me, the first therapist I had, great therapist, horrible therapist for me, because I would talk and talk and talk, and he would say nothing for 2 or 3 sessions.
Oh,
And I
wow.
would sort of ask a question, and he would say, why does it matter if I, am this or that? And I think I would ask very basic questions, and he would always ask a question back. And I never could build trust for him. And what I realize now, having started to reflect, is that his style, which was called Lacanian, which I had no idea what that was
Wow.
one that was very much about, not challenging, leaving space, just holding space. And what I needed was someone who was more challenging, someone who could kind of like be a thought partner, who could kind of go back and forth with me and kind of, if I'm going in one direction, actually challenge that and really examine that, and then give me tools and resources to change that thinking. And I ended up going with a therapist who does what's called dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT. And that's all about mindfulness plus tools and resources. And she was Asian American. She was a lawyer that went to Penn Law before she was a therapist. And so fit wise was the perfect fit for me from an education and a background perspective. But then her toolkit that she was using, like how we interacted in the room, was like after one or two sessions, I was like, she's got it. Right. I never was wondering like what's even happening here because
Wow.
I was feeling that change. She was helping me see things differently. She was challenging, and that chemistry was there. It's kind of like how do you know you have a good friend versus someone who's like kind of not a good friend? It maybe a good friend for you is a very different than a good friend for me, kind of. So it's all about finding the right fit. And I think that's what happens in the room and that's how a therapist wants to interact and what they use as their toolkit is a really important factor in finding that fit.
This is giving me so many more questions, and I have to like find a way to ask it because okay, there's like three things here that it's just expanding my question set here. So the first thing is like, how many damn categories like Laconian or DB are there on the back end of your AI that you have to figure out, right? That's the first question. The second thing I'm wondering is like, as a podcast host, somebody who's asking questions, I'm like, are there styles to this now to make it sort of, because I always think of it as this is not a one size fit all profession. Like I can't go into everybody and pull off the same, but I'm managing after almost 300 episodes to kind of find my rhythm and pacing. But I wonder if I kind of can categorize who I'm sitting in front of, maybe I can switch positions and, go according to who the guests were. This is so interesting yet terrifying to me.
I think the answer is you're doing a great job, no matter what, Kenneth. I think you're doing a great job. Your listeners love you, so I think whatever's happening is working, right? Um, there are hundreds, actually, types of therapy, hundreds of
Wow.
different modalities and orientations, and I think they fall within a few big categories. So, it's like DBT, which is dialectical behavioral therapy, is a behavioral therapy. So it kind of thinks about your thoughts, your worldviews and your actions being interconnected. And if you change one, you can influence the other. And there are other types of therapy that are like cousins, like cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, that's a cousin to DBT. So it's almost, I mean, just like there are different tons of different science specialties, there are tons of different specialties and different orientations for therapy. And I think the good news is, it's not as rigid. So, some therapists are purists, they do just DBT, but some may pull in other different types of tools as well. So while it's really important and we factor those in, it's not so much that you can, get lost. You must find someone that does X, right? Because you could find someone that does X, but be still a horrible fit for you. So I think it's the good news is we use over 50 different factors in matching a client to a therapist. And that's why it's more accurate than if someone tried to process and do this all themselves. Because, like, for some people, actually, race may not matter at all. And for other people, race may matter more than style, right? And for some people, actually having someone older than you and being a mentor and a guide is more important. Some people just want someone who's a peer, who's kind of been through it with them and who's in the trenches with them. So I think all of those things make it really sometimes hard to find the right therapist. But there's no silver bullet, and definitely orientation is not the silver bullet. But it's like, I think what you do really well is you tailor your questions to both the interviewer, your podcast guest, but your listeners. And there are other podcasts that are much more aggressive, and they're like, all about screaming and talking, and others that are much more quiet and thoughtful. And I think that chemistry between you and your guests and your listeners is what makes this podcast special and why the listeners who choose this podcast end up wanting to listen to you over somebody else. And I think similarly with therapy, it's just finding the right fit for you.
This is almost like the eHarmony game to me, right? It's
We've had folks say that we are like the eHarmony for therapy. Yeah.
wow. And it makes me think about all the therapists or all of the other things that I've looked for in my life. I mean, if you think about Yelp and you want to go on and find a handyman or a therapist, you can't just do that anymore. There's like levels to this picking out the professional game, right? There's levels to this game of picking out the person you want to work with because if we're not asking the right questions, we're not going to get tailored to what we are expecting.
Yeah, it's funny. When I first started to reflect, I thought about there are reviews for therapists on Yelp, but the whole premise of Yelp and these idea of reviews, and we do not have reviews for our therapists that are public. We do collect feedback on all our therapists, and we use that as part of the matching and the algorithm. But the inherent idea of Yelp, I think the assumption of Yelp is that if I read these reviews, those customers will have similar tastes to me. So if someone says 4 stars or 5 stars, I might agree with that, right? But if I really like spicy food and all the reviewers on Yelp like bland food, they may say give something 5 stars and and recommend restaurants that I go to and really don't like, right? Now, luckily with Yelp, the way that they normalize that is I think restaurant tastes are a little bit more clearly defined versus therapy is more vague. And so for us, it's not about just trusting someone else's review because that person has to be someone that you trust. And you must believe that their view or their review is similar to what your experience might be like there. Right. And I think that's a thing that's hard, especially in therapy, when you don't even know what you need and you don't know if the people that are going to therapy, maybe it's just a bad fit. It's like we don't have reviews for dating. We wouldn't have a Yelp for people for dating. I think that would be, it'd be a very interesting
Yeah.
experiment. But the reason we don't is because the person who dates you and is like, he's a great guy, may be very different from someone who wants to date me. Right. I think I suspect that they're very different. And so, so it's good to be who I'm attracting is very different from who you are attracting, Kenneth.
It's such a funny thing to say. When you started out 5 years ago and you committed to this path, what are some of the questions that you said to yourself, hey, I have to have these kind of questions going into this sort of mindset of this type of company? In other words, what were the questions that you had to ask yourself before you said, I'm going to make this commitment to this path?
It's very interesting because I did not set out to be a founder. I've always liked solving problems, and when I was in consulting, I loved tackling tough problems for my clients, and they were often Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies. And I travel around the world. I worked in Africa and Europe, and so I've always liked solving problems. But I really enjoyed my life as a consultant, and I liked that lifestyle. I think for me, when I was, you know, looking at what to do, the thing about this was it was almost by accident. I'm really curious how you started your podcast, but for me, it was sort of like it. I'm a guy who I walk into a restaurant. I'm like, oh, I would do this differently, or I would rearrange this. I'm always about like improving things. And this was an area where I felt this personal need around mental health, and I sort of was like, oh God, this is really hard. And after a few weeks, months, I would mention it to a friend, and the friend would be like, "Oh yeah, I had a horrible time finding a therapist too." And it feels like this was like an idea that just had this gravitational pull
Hmm.
that was pulling me back to it. And I would go, "Oh, what about this dating app, or what about this like networking app?" And I would think about other things just casually through my day, and it would just keep coming back to something about the mental health space. And so it would be months and I would be thinking about other things and I kept coming back to this idea and I wouldn't be kind of revisiting other ideas as much as this one. And so I was like, I really just want to learn more about this. And to your point around kind of being self-aware, I was aware that I didn't know a lot about therapy
Hmm.
and I wasn't a therapist. And so I seek to just learn about the space. And I ended up doing, I had probably over 100 coffee chats with therapists and with people who had tried therapy just to learn about their experience. Like, how was it? What worked for you? What didn't work for you? What do you like? What didn't you like? And I think through that experience, I started to come up with like almost accidentally this idea of how I could do it better. And then I was like, I really do believe this has some legs here and it could make the world a better place. And so then it was just about, well, let me just try and see. Let me just, I think this is what I would use to match. I think this is how I could get therapists on the platform. Those first 30, 40 therapists that I interviewed ended up being the first 30 therapists on my platform. And a lot of them are still on the platform right now and are still really successful with Reflect years later. And it was really like, could I get them could I match them with a client? And our first client who I matched to a therapist chose a therapist with Reflect And she stayed in therapy for years with Reflect. And for me, that was really a great sign that, hey, I'm onto something here. And so I think that each time, each step along the way, it was just sort of like curiosity and getting positive feedback that what I was thinking about was actually working that kept me going.
There are levels to everything, like I always say. And there are levels to the way therapists get paid here in LA. There's some therapists that get paid $500 an hour. And then there's therapists that would do it for $40 an hour. There is this huge price range within the physical going to a therapist's office space, right?
Mhm.
How can I look at that sort of price discrepancy within the model of quality versus pricing? Because I hate to say it, but sometimes a $200 therapist is very different from a $40 therapist, right? Because that's sort of like my experience. And I've heard all my friends say it too. There's 350, and some of these therapists come with like these heavy MBA backgrounds that can guide you through organizational management in a business. So they're worth 350 an hour. How does this price discrepancy work in the model of the eHarmony side of what you do?
It's I love that you asked this question because at the beginning, when I was looking for a therapist, I was so confused by the different prices, right? And I was like, is this therapist really, this $100 therapist versus this $150 therapist? Is the 150 therapist really 50% better than the $100 therapist? Like, am I going to get better faster? Is it just each interaction to be better? I didn't understand. And actually, I will let you in a little see that price and even years of experience have no correlation to the quality of the therapy itself.
And I'd imagine that. But at the same time, my second question is, why would a therapist do X amount and be constant at this price level with an online thing and not go out and do a bigger number, a bigger price in the real world?
Yeah, so actually, what we did at Reflect is we went out and we said we're going to screen every therapist to make sure they're quality, and we're going to actually pre-negotiate a rate with our therapists. So our sessions start at $145 a session. And so much more affordable than $300 plus that you're seeing for some therapists. And actually, we can look at the data and say how good every therapist is. And we're going to match you only with good therapists. And we look at basically what's called conversion, which is their likelihood to actually, if they talk to you, have a client choose them as a therapist, and how well they're doing over time. We collect feedback from all of our clients on how the therapist is doing. So we don't think price is a signal of quality. We think we can find other things, actual real outcomes, actually how clients feel about the therapist. That should be a signal of outcome that we can use to measure quality, right? And so I think that's the way that, when you go to Reflect to get matched, you're not just getting matched with the right therapist, but you're also getting matched with a good therapist. And that I think is a really important thing, because there are platforms out there that you can pay $45 a month, $99 a month, text your therapist. You're not going to have the same experience. And I think what does matter, we looked at a price that was enough for therapists if they had a full caseload on Reflect to do very well and not be like looking and doing other things. But you'd also want your therapist not to be burning out. And sometimes therapists who charge a low amount, they'll do that for select clients because they really feel like they want to make therapy accessible to people that are in need. So it's called sliding scale, which I think is really great. But then there are other therapists who, if you have to take insurance, or if you're charging a very low rate for all of your clients, you're gonna have to see a lot more clients to make ends meet. And the problem with seeing a lot more clients is, as you know, if you're having 10 meetings in a day, you might forget what you talked about with each of those people. Yeah. And that's just, your brain can only hold so much. And so I think we wanted to balance and make sure there was a price that made therapists comfortable and successful on the platform, but also where they could still give quality therapy to each person that they were bringing on from Reflect.
145, you said, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I understand now. I kind of am judging that at 145, this is not a $40 program,
No.
Now we're talking, I didn't realize that. I didn't put one and one together, but when you throw out a number like that, it automatically sticks in, somebody who's gone through therapy a few times like me. Oh, I understand what 145 means, right? It's like that. It's a substantial number, but it won't break the bank like at 300 for an entertainment therapist here in LA. But at 145, you are probably getting a really good therapist. That's just sort of my experience.
Exactly. And I think that's, you never wanted to sacrifice quality, right, in order to get match you, because we know that if we match you to some random person, and we have actually people who've tried other platforms that are like, I had a horrible experience and I want to try Reflect. So for us, not sacrificing on quality was really important. But I think that, even for 145, it is a lot for some people. And so we do things like we have a membership program that helps reduce costs. We help clients file for out of network reimbursement, and we use technology to help facilitate that so that you get some money back from your insurance companies if you have a PPO. So we really work hard to try to find ways to make therapy more accessible. So even the 145, we're saying let's make sure we attract quality therapists, and let's do work on the back end, the administrative side of the world, to help make it even more affordable. Because again, the one thing you cannot sacrifice in therapy is quality. Because I've wasted 6 months with a therapist that was a bad fit for me, and those 6 months I can't get back, right? And I think time is so valuable in our lives, and so for us, we don't want to sacrifice quality.
And there's a danger to finding a bad therapist too, that they can lead you down a terrible leave a terrible taste in your mouth that you don't go back. There's that danger too.
Absolutely, Kenneth. And like actually, this is a sad statistic. The most common number of therapy sessions per person is one. And so, can you imagine going through this long life struggle, finally realize, I'm ready for therapy. And then you look and look and look and look, finally find someone's availability, you pick somebody and you have a horrible experience, right? That just makes you want to crawl back in your hole, drink or do horrible things and self-medicate and get worse. And I think that's the worst thing that we can do, is to discourage people who finally put themselves out there to want help and have a really bad experience. And so I think that's what we're really thoughtful about, making sure that we match clients to the right therapist. We have a very strong, 90% plus success rate. But if for some reason what you need is different from what you thought or different from what we can give you, we also want to be there to say, hey, try for free again. We'll rematch you to a better therapist or someone that's a better fit for you. And so I think it's heartbreaking, because I've had so many friends who are like, I hate therapy. Therapy is horrible. I had this one guy, I went to one session and he was horrible, right? But I've had bad haircuts. I don't stop getting my haircut.
Go
right?
on bad dates. Yeah, you don't
go on bad dates. Exactly. And I think that's really, and it's because we're sort of like used to, okay, that bad date or that bad haircut is the exception to the rule, versus for therapists, we say, one bad experience and you extrapolate every therapist as being bad.
I am not in the business of asking people about their special sauce. But I do want to ask if you can dance around it, or if you can kind of illuminate this question somehow. I am curious of what are the criteria for being a therapist for Reflect?
That's a good question. And I think that, I can't give you all the criteria. And I think we look at, again, over 50 different factors when we're screening. And we have a wait list of therapists that want to join our platform, by the way. So we don't necessarily even let everyone who wants to be a therapist with Reflect be a therapist with Reflect. But I think what's really important is they have to, there are minimum state level certifications and requirements, right? So we meet those. So you have to have a certain number of degrees, certain number of hours of training to become a therapist. And, so that all is kind of state mandated, and we at minimum meet that. But what's really important is we interview and talk to every single one of our therapists on our platform. And most platforms don't do that, because they're just about just bringing therapists on. And I think, for us, the screening criteria, we look at a bunch of different factors and really thinking about how is that therapist will they do well? Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure the therapists we bring on, we're setting up for success as well, right? Because their time is valuable. If we're not working for them, we want to know that. And I think it's about making sure, we don't have any kind of prescription around orientation or style. So, that Lacanian therapist may be good for somebody on Reflect, not maybe me, but maybe good for somebody else. So we're not saying you can't be on Reflect, but we want to make sure that we're matching. you to the right therapist, right clients for you. I think one thing actually that I was surprised about is there's a lot around just the kind of normal how do you do therapy, showing up for appointments, making sure that you're there. A lot of that, I was surprised that there's some therapists who will no show at appointments or will miss those things. So we screen for those things as well because we want to make sure it's a good experience both for clients and both for therapists. And we've all had horror stories
Yeah.
of meeting a therapist who like, they don't show up or you have scheduling issues or those things. And so we really think that we can find great therapists and you don't actually have to be good at business. Most therapists are horrible at business, but if they work with Reflect, we actually have scheduling software for them. We have reminders for them. We have kind of billing software for them to make their jobs easier so that they can be successful on our platform. And so it's all about creating a good experience and a high quality experience for our clients.
Any chance that you will be taking this knowledge, this structure, this information back to Vietnam one day?
It's very funny because we've actually had outreach. One of our investors actually is in Vietnam, and he was saying how important therapy is. And luckily, there are actually some international rules are open. So never say never. But we've already had outreach from folks in Vietnam that are saying, "Hey, I need a therapist," and there's no good platform in Vietnam. So I think it's not in the near future, but it's very, very possible. And we're really proud that we have Vietnamese speakers on the platform as well. And we talked to a lot of Vietnamese folks to find the right therapist.
I wonder what the accreditation looks like in Vietnam, right? Because it seems like a relatively new practice and that it's not widespread in terms of college kids taking psychology courses a lot or understanding that this might be a profession that is going to be helpful to the country at some point and to the people. It's almost like a civic duty to talk about mental health to me. That's just like part of our conversation that needs to happen more. I want to do more of this kind of conversation on the podcast. But when I think about your reach potentially in the future, I think about Vietnam and I think about, how do you do this?
Yeah, and I can't speak because I've not done a lot of research about Vietnam itself, but from what I understand, there are much fewer regulations, and the therapy industry is not as robust as it is in America. And I think California, we're very lucky that we have some of the most therapists per capita than in many states. So in some ways, I think we're fortunate. That's not the case in a lot of other countries, especially Vietnam. And I think that, you think about we all have struggles and we all have things we need to deal with, especially once we've gone through a war or gone through all this really tough past. And so I think there's a real opportunity to help everybody process what they've gone through so that we don't, I think, pass it along to our children. And, this month, May, is Mental Health Awareness Month, but it's also Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And I think I've been talking a lot about transgenerational trauma and this idea that, if we don't work on ourselves, we're going to inevitably pass it on to our children. And I think that that's true for Vietnamese Americans, and it's very true for Vietnamese folks in Vietnam too. We went through a really horrible, horrible time in history, and I don't think any of us have really processed that to the fullest degree that we could.
I completely agree with you. Yeah. What's next for Reflect? What's next for your journey at the platform?
I think now that you've put in my head, maybe Vietnam is next for us. I think the great news and the sad news is that there's a need everywhere. And you mentioned there's tons of platforms out there. I think what we do is very unique, and I think how we support both clients and therapists is very unique as well. And so we're continuing to expand. We have a wait list in so many markets and so many states, and so it's about continuing to grow and continue to be able to help more people find the right therapist, because I think, our mission is to make quality mental health more accessible. And I think there are a lot of people that still need therapy in the world.
Well, I do hope you expand on that mission because we do need it. There's 98 million people in Vietnam that, there's new things that are happening, new industrial development, new ways of living that are in conflict with the culture of the past. That needs to have reconciliation. And I don't mean like, war and that kind of reconciliation. We just, as human beings, we're constantly needing to reconcile with the modern moves of the newer generation, parents and teachers or whatever have to, bosses and workers, right? They all have to deal with like new modes of living as a result of technology and industry.
It's so funny, Kenneth, that you say this because I just think about the amount of change that we've seen in our lifetime. And
Yeah.
I was watching something recently on YouTube, and it was showing scenes from Cheers, that '80s movie, and someone who looked like they were, and you know, you look at the characters, and you're like, oh, they must be in their like 40s and 50s, and they were like 23 and 29, and you just see how much even just our own, how we look has changed so much in the last 30, 40 years, let alone technology and now AI, and I think humans we're not used to this fast change.
Yeah.
I think our brains can only handle so much change. And I think even for me, and again, I'm, in my early 40s as well, so similar age as you. I remember when we didn't have internet and we didn't have computers, and now all of a sudden we're talking about AI and robots and Alexas and all these things. And I think that like what is going to happen in the next even 10 years or 20 years is going to be a massive change. And it's really hard for us to be able to adapt to that change. And I think therapy is really helping you think about yourself, process, and adapt to change. And I think that the more that we can build those tools, the faster we can adapt, the more that we can be nimble to whatever comes our way.
Well, I hope in the next few years, if you have any developments, you would let me know, reach out. And I welcome this conversation. It's a very lovely conversation. It's a warm conversation with somebody who's so knowledgeable. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today.
Well, thank you, Canada. That sounds like we're going to go to Vietnam together, apparently. Maybe that's what's going to be happening sooner than that.
Anytime. I mean, that's a conversation that needs to happen. And I think that somehow you should put it as a priority because I think I hate to say it, but there's a lot of people that need help in our, and it's just because there's so much changes. That's all. I'm not making a remark on society or anything. I'm just saying there's so much change right now that it could be very beneficial for everybody that you're starting an operation in Vietnam.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we'll first start definitely with Vietnamese Americans, and there are a lot in California and America that can still benefit from therapy. But I think I really appreciate the chance to speak about this because I think for our community as well, there's so much historic stigma around therapy. And I hope that, by hearing your story, I'm really glad you shared about your experience in therapy and hearing my story and realizing that, successful people can also go to therapy and it's not mutually exclusive, that more people will be willing to do it. Because I think again, as you said, we all could benefit from it.
This is how big I am a champion of therapy. My mother says to me all the time, I wish you would have become a therapist. She always says that to me. And
wow.
I'm a big proponent of therapy. I really think that it's a necessary thing in human beings.
It is, and I love that. I love that you that your mom said that because I think that's really really amazing, and I think that the more that folks can embrace that and talk about that, I think we need more Vietnamese podcast. We need more Vietnamese podcasters. We need more Vietnamese therapists as well because I think that being able to trust the person on the other side is really important, and I think part of when I built Reflect, 30% of our therapists are therapists of color. We have LGBT therapists. We have therapists that are older. So being able to see the person across the table from you as being like you is really important. So we do need more Vietnamese therapists as well.
And I've considered it. I've considered it. If there wasn't the way, because there's 3,000 hours here in California, right?
It's a lot. It's a lot. Yeah.
But my therapist, when I had first gotten into it, she was just coming out of she was just getting into her 3,000 hours. And I remember she was $20 at the time. This is 22 years ago. She was $20. And I was just getting this brand new person, but she was in her 40s. And she was a successful businesswoman. And so she was guiding me in business as well as like dating and all of this, and worked out really well. I kept her for 7 years in my life, and introduced her to like 50 people because they saw the
Amazing.
change in me. And I always was like, oh my God, I would love to do this. And then at the end, she was like, when I kind of like drifted off 10 years after that, she was trying like 250, $300. And she was good.
It's Mine was my therapist that worked really well, the one that I mentioned that went to law. She was a lawyer before.
Wow.
She was also an associate. And I think that, like I said, experience doesn't correlate
Yeah.
um to success. But I think having another career before and being able to walk in the shoes of your clients is really important. And we have a lot of second career therapists.
It's
Um,
huge.
so
So yeah,
yeah.
consideration that I've thought about before, but yeah, it's grueling to work for, I don't know, $50 an hour, doing that for, but whatever, that money shouldn't be the thing. But I mean, it's not, it's definitely a hindrance when you think about the long hours that you have to train for.
It's a lot. It's a lot of work, and I think that's it's daunting for a lot of folks. And so, and again, we're trying to make it easier for folks to be able to start practices once they come out, so that they can, we can make that journey easier and get more good therapists out here.
Jonathan, thank you so much once again.
Thank you very much. And Kenneth, I would love to, if possible, I think, for your listeners who are looking to try therapy, I'd love to do a little, open that up and welcome them to try Reflect if they want to, because I
Yeah,
think that, like you said,
where can we find Reflect?
yeah, so you can go online to www.joinreflect.com. So Reflect is spelled REFLECT.com. And I'll share the URL with you so you can share it with your listeners. And we'll give a little promo code for folks who want to try it out as well.
Wonderful. Thank you once again, Jonathan.
Beautiful. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Vietnamese with Kenneth Nguyen. Special thanks to Brittany Tran, to Jane Nguyen, Catherine Nguyen, Tina Pham, Sydney Jamie, and Christo Trin. Please find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at The Vietnamese Podcast.